Thank you. This is just a fantastic panel that we have gathered here to discuss such an important topic, and so I couldn't be more pleased to participate in this. I thought a great way to start this off is, gentlemen, I work at the cross of nonfiction and fiction, and thus I'm always on the lookout for both real world themes, issues, but also story ideas. So help me out with that. Paint me a picture of what day one of a potential next major war with a great power, a World War III, what does day one look like? And I'd like to sort of break that down, and we'll do it in a series of questions. What does day one look like in terms of the key threats that the US might face? And how, let's say first, how is that being experienced by someone in a leadership role? How is it playing out, say, at the tank in the Pentagon or in Fort Meade where you used to work at? What does it look like? So why don't we begin with General Alexander?
So I think, Peter, to start out on that question, you need to look at what are the objectives that the adversary wants to achieve in his day one. And so they're going to have done, leading up to day one, a whole series of work. It's not just that A happens, that they should have a plan of how they're getting access, the events that they want to do, because cyber, in my mind, is going to be used very similar to the way we see physical war go on. Their objectives are to shut certain things down, to cause us to make decisions or do things that we wouldn't want to do, and to capitulate in ways that we would not normally capitulate. What do I mean by that? If you think about warfare, I'm a technical guy, but if you think about warfare, the art of warfare is to get the enemy's civilian population to give in. So if you think about that, the first thing that they would go after is how can I hurt industry? If I want to make this really hurt the US, what could we do to hurt the US? So you wouldn't want to shut down the energy grid or the IT to start out with because you lose your access. But what you could do is start shutting down parts of the commercial enterprise to make us feel pain. You know, it's interesting to look at things like sunburst and solar winds. Imagine if we destroyed the data on all those companies' systems, the impact that would have. And many would say, oh, that wasn't me, that was kids doing it or somebody else. Think of what Russia did in the Ukraine in 2017 with NotPetya. So I think the adversary is going to start looking at things that they can do to cause us pain, to ratchet this up, and always have in their back pocket the ability to take steps to make it hurt worse. So going from hurting business to hurting IT infrastructure to shutting down energy, shutting down government, we could go back and forth. Is that good or bad, depending on where in government you do that, doing something in Congress, but you're going to see all that. And I think I would add in to that discussion the thought of misrepresenting what's going on, adding in false narrative. If you think about what Russia's done in the Ukraine, I think you'd see a very similar thing here. The concern that I'd put on the table is nobody has really thought through the art of war and cyber to the extent of what could be. So that question that you have is perhaps one of the most important questions that the military has now facing it, because like everything else, it's going to be right on the doorstep of the Defense Department and the intel community to take this on. They're the ones that can defend this country. And so this is bigger than a lot of people think. You know, we aren't used to thinking about how bad it can be until something bad really happens. And what alarmed me about SolarWinds and then the Microsoft hack is the extent. What if that had been destructive? What would we do? How would we react from that? Where do we go? 9 major departments of our government shut down, and all those companies potentially could have been shut down, as the Russians did with NotPetya against FedEx and others. So I'm worried about the extent and the ripple effects of how they would do it. And I know we think about that a lot. I think the adversary thinks about that a lot. That changes warfare as we know it today. I believe it will be used. It is being used as an element of national power. So I'll pause there because I think there's more that Chris and the general can add into that. But from my perspective, we don't think as bad as the adversary will in terms of targeting our country. And we have the greatest infrastructure, the most vulnerabilities, the biggest glass house of anybody in the world. And we've really got to take this on.
So, General, I want to follow that up because what was interesting is he laid out a scenario where much of the adversary action was taking place outside of military networks, whether it was civilian infrastructure, critical infrastructure, files in a variety of systems, to a dose of disinformation, maybe clouding what's going on. So as that's happening, what does that look like from the perspective of an office in the Pentagon? And does it even have situational awareness? How is it responding? And then also, are there elements on military networks that would concern you? What does it look like on the military network side, perhaps?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Great question. And I look to you. You're a master at like recognizing artifacts of a transformation in warfare, and then extrapolating from the artifacts into consequences, right? Like, okay, these artifacts mean that we'll be faced with these kind of challenges, and so just taking a play from your book, I mean, we have to look at the artifacts, right? If you learn from the artifacts, then you can start to extrapolate what it looks like further down the line. And so I think for me, it's about, those artifacts are foreseeable, right? And so it's a question of, can you foresee what's foreseeable in the artifacts that you see around you? So we see the artifacts in the information age, and I think all of us are pretty well conditioned in that space, right? Attacks on critical infrastructure, shut down communications, interfering with certainly defense networks, but also, those infrastructure elements that support defense networks. In most cases, civilian and military, electrons fly along next to each other, right? So like all of that stuff is pretty, I think, fairly straightforward. And so, the result is, the inability to move, right? The shutdown of power grids, the loss of communications, the delay of supplies and critical requirements. So I think, so let's talk about Yamamoto, right? Yamamoto said, hey, I'm afraid we may have just awakened a sleeping giant, right? Now, in 1941, 1942, I mean, the industrial might of the United States slowly cranked into action and built up a momentum and built up a wave that could then, take out dictators across continents. Today, we don't have that kind of time, right? When the giant awakes, the giant already finds out that he's pinned down with 1,000 little wires, and can't move, right? And so our reaction time to understand what's happening and to be able to respond to that has cut down to just a minimal level. And so we've got to be thinking now about the resilient architecture that you have to create and the resilience in that system, so that when you wake up, you're not tied down by 1,000 threads. And I think there's another aspect, just to build on what General Alexander talked about. There's this whole psychological, sociological aspect of this that we see in the information environment around us, right? We see the artifacts of social and psychological warfare at a societal scale in the media world around us, right? I mean, we all see it every day when we're holding our handhelds. I think when you think about, when you think about that, it makes it worse, right? Because now not only is Gulliver, tied down with 1,000 threads, Gulliver's got little voices in his head saying, you know what, don't bother getting up, everything's cool. So like this whole introduction of this natural extension of what, became what, was command and control warfare, became cyber warfare, became information warfare. and now flows into human psychological, sociological warfare. You can just see the natural progression of warfare, and understanding those artifacts. I mean, Peter Singer could write a kick-ass novel about like what does that mean, right? What does that look like? So I think that's a something that we have to look for. Artifacts. If you see the artifacts, extend the artifacts, and you can start to tell what's going to happen.
I think it's interesting when you say see the artifacts. It's almost like if we're painting, the parallel you gave is Yamamoto in 1941. What were the artifacts beforehand that were indicators? So if it's using airplanes to attack ships in a harbor, Toronto, it happened a year earlier than Pearl Harbor. Or if we're thinking about the lash up of armored warfare and wireless communication, the Spanish Civil War was a battle lab. And much the way some people have argued, and this goes to General Alexander's examples, that what played out in Ukraine or even the Syrian civil war have been a little bit of a battle lab for the way these might play out elsewhere. Chris Inglis, let's get you in here. And what I'm interested in is, so we've heard about this is playing out potentially on civilian networks. We've heard about doses of disinformation, but also we've got potentially military networks at least being sought to compromise. What does this look like from the lens of someone sitting at Fort Meade? And how much of this is it positioned to have insight into, given that there is not a clear foreign or domestic sort of split in it, right? Very different than past conflicts.
Yeah, so Peter, thanks. If I could start by building on the comments already made and then go after that question directly. I would say that day one of a future conflict is probably going to be day N of our adversaries' preparation for that. They will not, as we used to in the past, see this as something where you detect a situation and you then rise to the occasion. They will have prepared for quite a long time for that day. They will have studied us to a fairly well. They will choose the field of endeavor that favors them, and likely not one where there's a head-to-head contest between our militaries or, for that matter, even our economies. I think in their capabilities, they will look to diminish our willpower. They'll look to diminish our command and control. We're not the largest military, but we think we're the most capable, largely because of our ability to leverage those with great synchronicity, with great effect. And they will go after our coalition to try to make sure that that coalition stays off the field. So with respect to willpower, I think that what they'll do well before an event of that sort is they'll try to figure out how to convince us that it's simply not worth the fight. They'll try to figure out how to create divisiveness within our society such that even if we thought it was worth the fight, we won't agree on what it is we would fight about and what our outcomes would be. I think that if you look at the efforts of the Germans in the pre-World War II era, where they thought that they could reach in and use America first to convince America to stay out of the war, they had no idea how America really thought, how it really worked, because they were trying to do that at a great distance, and they didn't have the sort of rich insights that today come naturally to anybody that's accessing the internet. Look at what our potential adversaries have done over the last few years in terms of studying us to a fairly well, collecting information about us, and then practicing those techniques on their own societies in terms of trying to influence them at scale. I think that what you can imagine is that those same adversaries would try to figure out how to use those influence ops to deny us kind of coherent, joined up willpower, or even if we had that, to create divisiveness such that on day one, we would experience something that actually has been well along the way in planning. In terms of command and control, you simply have to make it such that, to General Alexander's point, the systems don't work. You can corrupt the data. You can perhaps flood it with new data, make it such that the environment is one where the systems simply don't know how to operate. And confusion in that regard will perhaps be far better than absolute head-to-head confrontation. And then with respect to keeping the coalition off the field, I think that our adversaries will try to keep whatever they do below a threshold that will invoke a coalition to come to play. So try to figure out what it is, what are the tripwires that would cause allies to come in and join with us in this activity. and make it such that they stay inside of that while still diminishing our efforts. Having kind of mentioned all of that, I will then go to your question directly. Let's use the example of NotPetya in 2017, kind of largely attributable to the Russians taking a big swing at the Ukrainians. That indiscriminate, brazen attack then got out of the box and it ran across Europe, took Maersk down hard, took down the European component of FedEx down hard, took down some other concerns hard. You didn't need to be the target to be the victim that day. And while it hadn't been their intent to remove a logistics base that would be useful or necessary for the American military to respond to some action that might have been taken in Europe, the lesson wasn't lost on them. That the American military, our coalition's military, is hugely dependent upon the private sector, not just in the cyber world, but for the flow of logistics in the kinetic world. And so I think you would see, kind of to General Alexander's earlier point, a huge focus on their part, on that part of our collective national security infrastructure that is owned, operated, maintained by the private sector, such that if they can diminish that, hold that back, then they at the same time hold the military back that would ride on that to essentially establish, you know, some terra firma on which we could then counter and prevail on that battlefield. Take away those advantages for us, it's not just a fair fight, it's perhaps an uneven fight that we will lose because we weren't preparing for day one the way they are today.
So when we look back at the last century of great power conflict and competition, in retrospect, there's been a crucial role of what you might think of as a game-changing technology. So if we think about World War I, it's the power that the machine gun had in changing expectations of how it would be fought. Or if we think about World War II, we've talked about already air power, the Blitzkrieg. The Cold War, of course, shaped by atomic weapons and the ICBM. So what do you think will be the crucial technology that would shape, well, we'll put it, that will shape great power competition and might shape outright conflict in that same way? And let's just go back in the same order.
So from my perspective, it's not one technology or one set of exploits or attacks. I think it's a combination of attacks that when I think about this, think about the solar winds and make that destructive instead of disruptive. I think what you have to do is you say, how are they going to try to fight back and what are the things that they're going to do? What's their response? I think Chris and General Green brought out some good points in that. What is it that we would do and how did they block that in the first phase of this? What could they do to disrupt that? A lot of disinformation and going out to the public and saying, here's what we're seeing, don't worry, this is about, you know, imagine if a wide-scale announcement said for all military personnel to stay at home because your offices are shut down because of communication and stuff, you know, and people are trying to get people to come into work, all the things that you could do, hospitals, healthcare, all these things that we depend on. I would look at how are they going to attack it and what are we going to do about it? And so what you start to get to is, are we prepared to fight in this way? And when I say that, the biggest challenge I think we have as a nation is the military and the Defense Department do a great job. But in this space, you need the commercial sector to be alongside, and somehow there has to be the communications between two so that the government understands when these things are being hit and time to do something about it. So if it were the physical world, it would be airplanes. So Chris wants me to bring in the Air Force. So bring in the Air Force. And what you'd say is, if somebody's going to bomb Denver, we would do something to stop it. But if somebody's going to attack Denver in the commercial or the cyber world, we don't know what to do about it because we won't see it. So I think what we have to do is step back and say, how are we organized and equipped to fight in this space? How are we going to bring that together? And then as you start to put that on the table, you start looking at that and you think, we're not ready. You know, the government is training that. We don't have this connection and we're at risk. That's my concern. When you think about it, the consequence of reciprocating an attack on SolarWinds, people say, should we attack back? We're not ready for day one that you bring up. And that in and of itself, it's not because the military is not ready. It's because I don't think we've organized the country, the government and the commercial sector to work together in this area. So what you're bringing up, Peter, I think is the heart of the issue we face as a nation. This is something that the government cannot do by itself. It has to be the government and the commercial sector working together. How do we share a call that I'm being attacked in time to do something about it? And then how do we have the authorities to go back and forth to bring them up? You know, I think about what's going on with COVID and all the hospitals and all that. They're being hammered with ransomware and other things. Imagine if that was a NotPetya-like attack on the healthcare system. And add in a few others in terms of this. My concern is, you know, I think we think the best in people. And at times it's difficult for us to think, what happens if they're not thinking like that? If they really wanted to hurt us, how would they do that? And if their back is up against the wall, what would they do to really make us hurt? And if it was part of a physical campaign, in this case, we're talking Russia. So if Russia wanted to take Eastern Ukraine, what do they do to keep us out of that with their day one, as you call it? And how would they do that? So I think, you know, from my perspective, you know, when I look out on this, I think that's one of the biggest issues that we face is how you bring all that together. And, you know, people are worried about the role of the military and intelligence community because of this space. And I'm not saying that we want the intel agencies inside your network. We don't. But those networks now have to be able to tell the military and the government we're being attacked. In SolarWinds, we couldn't do that. Nobody saw it. They didn't see it. They couldn't tell the government. And they couldn't tell the people that could do something about it until December. Think about that. That is a huge issue for our nation. And so we now have to step back and say, given that, what do we do? How do we organize? And how do we give people in the Pentagon and in the intel community the authorities to do what they need to defend our nation while protecting civil liberties and privacy?
So, Lieutenant General, I'd summarize the broad suite of vulnerabilities in our supply chain when it comes to software is what General Alexander is laying out there, and the way that might be mobilized to target against us. That would be sort of the suite of technologies if we're writing after the fact a history of it. That for him is a key vulnerability, a key technology change that matters in much the way of the machine gun or the atomic weapon. How about for you?
Yeah, thanks. I agree with General Alexander wholeheartedly. Let me add another one for consideration. I think the transformation of defense capabilities writ large in the U.S. and elsewhere through the integration of artificial intelligence and man-machine teaming that results will be absolutely transformative and game-changing. And so that has severe implications, right? It is how how do you deal with 6 hypersonic missiles coming at you simultaneously? How do you deal with that? How do you counter that in the time frame of seconds or tens of seconds? Across a fleet, say in somewhere in the Pacific. You have to bring in machines to manage data and to be able to help humans make those decisions at machine speed. And that term is used. There's a lot of hype associated with that. But honestly, if warfare is going to accelerate to machine speed, then we have to be able to operate at machine speed, and that means defensively and offensively. And so I think that's really critical. And so there's so much, again, artifacts. There's so much to be learned from the commercial environment, right? So you see, in the commercial environment that we all exercise every day and participate in every day, the data environments, the ecosystems, the ability to buy products and buy services, check the weather, check the baseball score from 2 years ago, like all of that has changed our lives. It's happened slowly enough that I think we've habituated ourselves to it to a degree. That same transformation into smooth, efficient, and effective enterprise capabilities has not penetrated the defense communities yet, right? This is where we stand today. Artificial intelligence, presumably a $16 trillion market in 2030, and yet the Department of Defense hasn't yet adopted artificial intelligence in all of its processes and all of its information flows for warfighting and for just straight up business efficiency, right? Like that technology is going to make all the change in the world. I think what's important to do then, you have to actually have to start implementing artificial intelligence, right? You have to start with process. It's not so much a technology conversation as it is a process conversation. How do you make decisions? How do you make decisions quickly when you have hypersonics coming at you or your power grid has been taken down? That process has to drive a demand signal for man-machine teaming to monitor situations, to collect the data, to inform decisions. And so that piece, it's under construction, but it requires wholesale change in a lot of ways that we do business, and change for the better. And oh, by the way, changes for which we have examples in the commercial environment all around us. I mean, think about like, I'm just thinking from a targeting perspective, right? Today, we precision navigation and timing information is a really important component of any modern force. Well, in a digital age, in a data-driven environment, if you could understand precision navigation, location, timing, but think of all the other direction, mission, composition, all of the other data artifacts associated with that object, whatever it is. Okay, suddenly you can make much more complex and much more high quality decisions on the battlefield. And so we have to get to this point. And I think there's a sense of urgency here only because this enterprise, this technology, this industry globally is exploding, right? And so we are going to miss a march here and remain vulnerable if we stick with segmented, stovepiped processes that are built for large-scale systems acquisition instead of a software engineering approach of building capability, making it a little better, testing it, failing, trying again. It's a complete. It kind of turns the whole defense acquisition process on its head. It's not about waiting for a contractor to deliver you a technology. It's building the capability yourself in your own networks, building trusted ecosystems, building trusted data sources, and the ability to share data, across systems. So I could go on, I won't, but I think this idea of thinking differently about defense and building that capability now, because the future that the artifacts point to is right around the corner, and there's a massive bow wave of cash and technology debt that is driving this industry, and we need to be on that wave, or we're going to be way behind.
So, Chris, we've heard about key challenges of software vulnerabilities across the supply chain, the criticality of AI moving forward. What are some key technology areas for you?
So first, kind of set the stage. I think that if you imagine that future battlefield, the worst case would be it's a hugely fluid battlefield, lots of breakage, lots of uncertainty, no interior lines, kind of your garrison is no longer your sanctuary. And it will therefore not be a contest of technologies or logistics. It's likely to be a contest where the party or the side that has the best strategic thesis that then unifies massively distributed capabilities in action, powered by the local sensing and innovation of the distributed assets, that side's going to win. So if you think about that, then you have to think about what are the technologies or the techniques or strategies that bring about that resilience and what General Goren talked about as the man-machine interface. How do you actually make that man-machine interface more resilient, more robust? The OODA loop is not dead. You want that to, at speed, at scale, be able to observe, orient, decide, act. And if you can outturn your adversary in the resilience of that, then you will likely prevail on that uncertain fluid battlefield. Coalitions also need to be appropriately resilient and robust. As General Alexander talked about, private-public coalitions, literal coalitions of many nation states, they need to make sure that they hang together despite the fact that they will not have a stable, static plan of action to proceed against. And so the muscle memory will be as important as any technology that they can bring to bear, such that they know how to support one another even if they're no longer in direct contact with one another.
I think what is interesting about your comments is also to look at them through the lens of what do potential adversaries think and what would they answer to this question. And while they don't show all their cards, there have been certain things that we can discern from, for example, translated Chinese strategic documents and discussions within their professional military education. And they've certainly talked about the shift from the revolution of mechanization to information to now it is about the rough translation is intelligization. So it's not just about having the data, it's about the discussion of AI and how that will allow you to draw insights that weren't previously possible. Or if you think about the inspiration they took from the game of Go, where the AI not only beat the top human at it, but the more important part, at least to PLA leadership, was that they won by utilizing an approach, a strategic approach that no human had come up with in the 2,500 years of humans playing with. That was the magic moment that got the eye of the PLA generals. And then you have the other part that we haven't talked about, which is the lash up with unmanned systems and the discussion of at least and some of that it may not be a triumph of merely about unmanned systems, but rather the rough translation is that the small and many will defeat the large and few. And then we can think about other manned systems where that might play out. So it'd be, alas, we can't bring in too many alternative views, but that layers within what you were after. It's interesting that the SolarWinds incident has come up repeatedly. And so I want to dig deeper into that and this challenge of supply chain security. What should we do about it? And I'm not speaking about sort of overall, I think we've hit very well the need for public and private sector to work together better. Let's take that down a level into what's a single policy proposal? What is something that you would like to see put into place? Either it's legislation, either it's a change in U.S. government. Let's get some specifics on it. What can we do to prevent the next SolarWinds, or even worse, the version of that playing out on day one of a World War III? General Alexander.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It stems right in what we were just talking about. When you think, I want to just step back and kind of put this in the context to answer that question. When you think about what's going to go on in warfare, I like what General Green and Chris talked about here in terms of think about this as a number of capabilities that are brought together, probably by some AI machine learning expert system that actually performs that. So a suite of tools to accomplish a mission. Now, when you step back and you think about it, what's missing from us? What's the problem? And I think the single biggest problem we face is there is no air traffic control for cyber. You can't see it. And the consequence, if you can't see it and the commercial sector doesn't see it in time to do something about it, we're always going to be behind and we will be surprised like we were with SolarWinds. So if I were to jump into one thing, it's in air traffic control. We did that when the aircraft came. My grandfather was part of the guys who would go out with binoculars and look for aircraft. Okay, not really reasonable when you think about it. That doesn't scale. And we can't have humans in this. So how do we use machines and indicators to say something's not right here and kind of push that up so that companies can work together and share that picture? Sectors can work together, states can work together, and we can build a picture to say something's not right and do it at speed. I think it goes to General Green's comment. And if you do something like that, you've just jumped into the world of machine learning and AI. There's so much going on that you have to bring this together and create that picture at network speed and share it between the public and private sector so that we can respond. I think everybody say, well, we can't do that. So that's right, that's hard. But that's what we have to do. If you want to fight in this space and you can't see the enemy, then they can do everything to you all over, and we're just sitting ducks. And so we have to figure out how do we make visible their attacks into our infrastructure in time to do something about it. That's the deal. And so I think, I use the terminology air traffic control for cyber so that you can see what's going on, identify the bad, and tell the people that are being attacked, hey, heads up, and tell the law enforcement or DHS or the Defense Department, I've got a problem and it's coming from Russia, and that we can do something in time to stop it. So that's what I would do. And I think if you look at that, Peter, that means you got to have the legislation to start getting the public and private sector to work together. You've got to have your rules of engagement of when you see that, what are they going to do about it? What's the commercial sector do? What's DHS do? What's law enforcement do? What's NSA and Cyber Command do? And are we set for that? So I think build that picture, show me how that's going to work. Chris and I had the experience of Buckshot Yankee. It was like, whoa, we've been attacked. The first thing that we asked the defenders is, what happened? Can you explain to me what happened to your network? And so when you start talking to people about what happened on the network, you get this really detailed issue, but it didn't explain the problem and what you really need to do in the physical world to help stop that. And so leaders at every level are out of the picture. And if those who are making decisions on the health and welfare of this nation are out of the picture, we're not going to have a good response. We're in trouble. And so I would simplify it to that air traffic control picture for cyber is what we really need to build for our country and our allies.
Can I follow up with a question? So air traffic control, though, derives from a agency. So we have in the aviation space, we've got the FAA. So in implementing your proposal, so if we say, look, we want the version of air traffic control, what are the organizational changes in terms of responsibilities or even new organizations that might need to be created that you would like to see to implement that?
Well, for sure, there's a lot that has to go on organizationally in our country in cyber. And I think that's a whole debate and another topic. But for this, I think we hook together all these radars to get a common picture. The FAA is responsible for air traffic controllers and some of that, but we're talking about what if we could create, all your SOCs could start seeing data of things that are hitting sectors around them. How do we do that? And, we're not going to solve this one picture and it's done. So we have to walk our way into building that picture between key elements of the government, critical infrastructure. So I think that's the first step. Build that, show us that you can do that. Then add in incrementally all the rest. So in week 2, you could then be going into these parts. And in week 3, we'd be done in a month. Nothing's too hard for those of us who don't have to do it. That should be easy.
In general, what would you put into place to prevent the next SolarWinds?
Yeah, I'll build off that the air traffic control algorithm there. So in air traffic control, you have a trusted ecosystem, right? So it's not just about the systems. Pilots know how to operate in that system. Air traffic controllers know how to operate in that system. Customers know how to operate in that system. Airports, cities, et cetera. They have an ecosystem, so it's trusted, right? There are certainly gaps that that sometimes heinous mistakes happen, but there's an ecosystem and an environment. Today in defense, we are still in a place where individual network owners, right, individual policies for individual data sets sometimes. We still fly hard drives around in airplanes because we can't move data from one network to another network because we don't have the permissions, we don't have the authorities, we don't have the policies, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of a trusted ecosystem that protects you, by making your data secure, making your environment secure, yet making it available to the people that need it for machine speed decision making, right? So that how do we do that? That's the hard part, right? So if there was one thing for Christmas, we need a Manhattan Project for a trusted ecosystem, right? That allows us to develop, to gather and store data, clean it up, make sure it's ready for AI, build AIs, keep the algorithms hot on, on an operational network in an operational environment so you can use them. Protect, have the right security construct, the right cloud, hybrid cloud construct for how you're going to support this. That ecosystem, then, from there, now you can start to move out, right? You've got a solid base that you can that you can move out from. And I think, all three of us would still say, the most vulnerable piece of that system is the human, right? Humans are always the weak link in a protected ecosystem. And so we have to figure that out, right? An AI is never going to click on the button that says, hey, you may have already won, some prize, right? But a human might. And so that's where we have to figure out, like, how do, what policies, what restrictions, what control do we give to machines in managing that environment? And so I think that protected ecosystem is the real magic. And that includes the ethical foundations, that includes the policies, that includes the campaigns or the plans for compute and storage, et cetera, et cetera. I gotta refer to your Go conversation. Yes, game two, move 37, right? The machine did something entirely unpredictable to the human, and the machine won. But remember, in game 4, move 78, the machine did the human did something that a human would never do. And it completely threw the machine off its game, and Lee Sedol won game 4 as a result. So we humans still have a role in this process.
Now you're sharing the lessons of the Burn-In book, that it's about a machine and a human team together.
Exactly. So Thames is my hero.
Yeah. Chris Inglis.
Peter, I support everything that's been said so far. That makes sense. I would take a half step back and first reimagine what a supply chain is. Ask most people, especially the uninitiated, what a supply chain is, and they think of a horizontal thread from capability generation to consumption, unbroken from alpha to omega. Of course, it's not that way at all. SolarWinds is actually a quite simple supply chain. You have a principal provider, and then they flow their material down that pipe to the users who then make use of it. Most supply chains are considerably more complicated than that. And most of them, when you take a hard look at them, are actually a series of adjacent verticals where you have some kind of very particular task inside of your vertical. You do that, and then you pass over the top of your stovepipe whatever you produce to the next party. They may use it in the way that you imagined or not. But what you have are these kind of permeable membranes that essentially across that horizontal are just pushing something from place to place to place, and each of those is defended alone. Back to something that I think both the generals mentioned, which is we have to figure out how do we defend this collectively. You're not going to do that by subordinating all members of the supply chain to some uber defender, because again, supply chains are flexible, they're agile, they're not the same for every party that's downstream. But what you need to get away from is that we each defend our patch all by ourselves towards where you have some greater degree of integration and collaboration, so that if a FireEye was able to determine that there's some sort of an anomaly in their implementation of a software that flowed from somewhere upstream, that by design that is richly and with some degree of real-time shared broadly across that supply chain, so that everybody can take a look and use their local knowledge, their local assets to say, do I see the other side of that? Do I see some piece of that? Can we crowdsource this so that we find it at the earliest possible moment, and we actually then interdict it with the highest possible leverage? So clearly you need to strengthen these supply chains, better hardware, better software development environments. You need to actually defend it. When General Alexander talks about running analytics to try to detect anomalies off that baseline, do that. But back to my point one, which is do that as a collaboration, not as a series of these exquisite divisions of effort, which are actually in agreement to not collaborate. And ultimately, we need to align actions to consequences. There need to be benefits for good behavior in this. We've spoken about what those good behaviors might be. And there also need to be consequences of a negative kind for those who are bad actors in this space. And thus far, we have been unable to align either in time or even in gravity the consequences that we would impose on Russians and others for taking massive advantage of our badly designed supply chains.
Fantastic. I would add in one other element to use the parallel of the air traffic safety is for the supply chain, but also cyber incidents overall. we could benefit from the equivalent of the National Traffic Safety Board, which is a group that is trusted to try and find the cause of a problem in a protect the community manner as opposed to finding liability manner. And that part is missing in some of the breaches that we've experienced so far.
Peter, can I come in and just mention that briefly? I was an aviator in the Air Force for a better part of 25 years. I was happy once. And what I recall succinctly is that when, in very few occasions, in my case, I'm happy to say, but when in an incident, the National Transportation Safety Board or their equivalent showed up, you would be very fulsome about describing what happened, because we weren't about to try to determine liability. We were trying to actually make a contribution to the collective safety of that system. You knew very clearly who it was that would then show up to try to put the pieces together for purposes of finding liability and imposing those consequences. And not that you would be less fulsome with them, but the conversation changes, right? So if we don't have an NTSB for cyber, then we're going to find that these conversations are always tainted or restricted by this idea that I'm not sure I want to say this because I'm not going to say it right the first time. Maybe I shouldn't say anything at all.
I want to go back to where we were and talking about great power conflicts. And it's interesting, Chris, when you were discussing earlier, I was reminded of arguably what was one of the most important moments in World War I, which was actually in the opening days of it, a English trawler that was unarmed dropped a big hook and essentially pulled up cable by cable the telegraph cables that linked Europe to America, except the ones that flowed through Britain. And that happens in 1914. And from that point on, Britain basically controls the information war over what America thinks about what's playing out in the battlefields of Europe. And 3 years later, the United States, in large part influenced by the British view of it, joins the war. That's not possible today in a world of social media and internet and the like. And so we've talked a lot about these new information warfare threats. General Alexander talked about how it might cause denial of even the war itself, or certainly division within the target audience. We've seen this play out without an active war happening. Every second of every day, United States citizens are inundated with disinformation campaigns on everything, targeting our democracy to targeting our public health. We've recently had disinformation campaigns going after coronavirus vaccines. And of course, they've also elevated domestic actors that have, of course, fueled extremism and division. So we know finally we have a problem. Now I turn to you all. What do we do about it? And let's break out what do we do about it in much the same way that you've discussed earlier. There's a government side and there is a civilian private sector side. So what are some policy changes that you would like to see to better prepare the United States for these new information threats, to do better in the ongoing, what I call the like war that's going out there? General Alexander.
That's a great question, and probably the hardest one to answer, because it now deals with how do you get accurate stories out there? How do you tell the truth on both sides? And that's not just from disinformation from the enemy, but also sometimes by ourselves. So I think this is the biggest problem that we face. So I think part of what Chris was hitting at, I agree with 100% on this, knowledge sharing and crowdsourcing. How do we do that to understand what's going on, what truth really is? When you look at how Russia has used disinformation in the Ukraine to get the ethnic Ukrainians and the ethnic Russians going at it, they talk about bayoneting 3-year-old Russian kids and putting them on the property of their parents. That never happened, but it got everybody up in a... So how do we get the truth? How do we establish the truth? And how do we get out in front of it? I think part of the problem right now goes back to, we all see our own small part of this. We don't understand all the facts that are there. So I think part of the solution has got to be some way of having the facts out there in a way that are irrefutable. how do we know what the facts really are? That's going to be the hardest part that we deal with, because there are things that go on. You say that can't be true, and you find out, yeah, that's true. Well, why would they do something like that? And whether it's in an election campaign or in something else, we see them doing this. I think, this may be an area that, as General Green gets into it, maybe this is an area for AI and machine learning to look at things that, when you look at that, the machine might start to say, that don't make sense. You guys are all racing down this road. Something doesn't make sense there. Can we figure out how to get truth into these deep fakes that affect these information campaigns, to understand when a campaign is going on? Because almost for sure it will be part of an adversary's overall campaign. So I think we've got to get out in front of it. I don't know personally how we're going to solve that problem. I think this is probably the hardest issue that we face. I do know, though, when you step back, one of the issues that we faced in Iraq was that every brigade had a lot of information, and it was difficult for them to share what they knew about the adversaries in their brigade area with other brigade areas, and the war in 2006 was going bad. What we came up with is the idea of sharing that information at network speed across all of them so they had that common view. So I think when I think about that air traffic control picture, I'm really talking about how are we sharing what's going on so that you can solve where the bad guys are traveling and perhaps solve this issue of, is it true or not?
General.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, and I do think I'm just pull the string on the deepfakes issue. I think we have a tsunami of deepfakes in our future, right? So this is like the ultimate phishing campaign, right? Where no kidding, now it's your mother telling you to click on that link, right? Like I think we have to be prepared with resilient societies here. It's not an inherent skill of democracies to organize at scale, right? And approach a problem with unity. But one of the benefits of democracies is once you actually do have unanimity and you have like-minded citizenry, holy cow, get out of the way, because that democracy is on is unstoppable because they're united. Well, this whole issue of deep fakes and information warfare and the sociological warfare, psychological warfare that extends from it is all about stopping democracies from exercising their great strength, right? And you see, you can see it today in, trolls across the internet and, Twitter feeds and all the other places that we see this. But honestly, I think, much more sophisticated hacking of society is in our future here, right? So we've got to think through already, okay, we've had hacking of our networks. We know on the dark web, there are archives of tools for hacking our networks. On the dark web, there are archives of tools for hacking our society, right? And that's what we have to really be cognizant of, because now, the danger is much more than joint, right? It's, we have to think beyond joint. We think we're very progressive in the department because we're thinking joint. Honestly, the challenges are so bigger than even joint that we have to think through this in a much more cohesive way. Stovepipes, segmented developments. I mean, this is kind of our historic past in the way we've done business, almost purposefully, right? That's how the Department of Defense kind of evolved. But I think we've reached, or the threat has certainly reached a point where joint is no longer sufficient. Certainly, services or organizational stovepipes are insufficient. How do we move past that, right? Like, how do we build trusted ecosystems, not a trusted system for the Army, a trusted system for the Marine Corps, a trusted system for the Navy, a trusted system for the Air Force, trusted system for the Space Force? No, that's not enough, right? We've got to think through, how do you move into an ecosystem approach to capability development and an ecosystem approach to defense?
Chris.
3 points, building on what's already been said. One, I think precision is back in communications. We've had our fling with broadcast, but Madison Avenue and a variety of other players have learned that I'm not interested in certain advertisements, and they know where I'm not or when I'm not able to buy something. And so they've used that massive data available about me to yield very fine-grained insights about me and targetable communications to essentially target me, not the class of people that I'm with or the kind of demographic that I represent or the socioeconomic status that I might. They're targeting me with great precision. Identity is the new perimeter in that regard. That's not lost on nation states who would use that as an instrument of national power. Two, technology and process can go some distance in trying to interdict that threat, but only a certain distance. We can try to figure out when 5 Russians are pretending to be 5,000 Americans and reveal that. We could do some fact checking, we could do some correlation to try to get closer to truth if there is such a thing, and kind of lay bare the facts underneath. But people are going to be more comfortable being driven into corners that they already think they want to be in than not. And so the ultimate defense, I think, is going to be found in the human being. We need to improve their critical thinking skills. We need to improve their knowledge of civics. To General Green's point, if this democracy is a meritocracy in terms of its competition against other forms of government, let's be full-throated about that. Let's understand why that is, and then ultimately have a powerful, transcendent message that we find more appealing than this divisive rhetoric that might drive me into a corner where I feel singularly kind of happier or more wealthy, that I prefer the kind of association of like-minded people because the transcendent message draws me one way as opposed to the kind of influence ops pushing me another. I think if we double down on critical thinking skills, civics, and powerful transcendent messages, try to remove some of the divisive rhetoric from our political systems, we'll be in a better place.
There's a wonderful parallel in terms of what you all have spoken to of cyber threats, the hacking of networks, to, as was said, the hacking of people on the networks, what I've called like war, is that across them, the remedy is not just traditional Cold War style deterrence, but rather building up resilience, or what we would call deterrence by denial. And that resilience might be, building resilience into the supply chain, but also building resilience into our political community, all the way down to individuals. And this is where I would give a shout out to the project that we have in cooperation between New America, where I'm at, and Cyber Florida, our hosts, which is a cyber citizenship project that's basically designed to provide digital literacy tools to K through 12 teachers in Florida, bringing them all together into the same place so that they can provide them to students. It's ironic, all of us have talked about the importance of this area, but at the pointy end of the spear, at the education side, right now, many schools don't have them available. Of the schools that do have these digital literacy tools, the teachers are literally reduced to Googling to find them, as opposed to bringing it all together in one place. And that's a great project we have with Cyber Florida going after trying to remedy that. We've got just a couple minutes, so I'd like to end with a rapid fire. And the question is this: when it comes to great power competition and conflict, and its cross with the cyber realm, what have we missed? What's an issue? What's a threat that concerns you that we didn't talk about in our conversation so far? What's something that should be on our collective radar screens that doesn't get sufficient discussion? General Alexander.
I think the key thing we hit in part, and that's the private sector is not able to actually tell us what's hitting them in time to do something about it from the government sector. And that big void is a huge vulnerability that they will and they are exploiting.
Hey, thanks to Cyber Florida for hosting us here. I would just say a couple of things. First, I think what we miss is how close this is, right? So PRC talks about their domination of the AI industry by 2030, and with their Made in China by 2025 program, we are very close to their window of dominance, right? We're in the department here. We're in POM 23 to 27, right? So our POM cycle goes, for a number of years. 23 to 27. China says they're going to be dominant in AI by 2030. How much of our POM equips us to compete with China in the AI space by 2030, right? That's a real question about real capabilities, about real investments today. And we have to pay attention to that. So, how close this is something we have to pay attention to. How big this is, I mentioned before, a $16 trillion economy, perhaps, a massive boost in American competitiveness, or a massive failure of American competitiveness if we don't embrace this mission area. And finally, how dangerous this is. We've talked about how the vulnerability of not just the information sphere, but the psychological sphere and the sociological sphere and even the democratic sphere, right? Like these technologies and these capabilities have the ability to underpin our very society, and we have to treat it with the severity that requires, right? And that means moving past stovepipes, moving past segmented approaches, and moving into a place where we're actually responding as a nation, responding as a department with all of the power and capability that we have at our fingertips and the enormous talent that we have access to. Thanks, Peter, for hosting us.
Peter, I would just add to that to say the danger of seams. There's no hard, bright, red, shiny line between competition and conflict, right? It's a continuum, varying only in intensity. And there should not be a hard, bright, red, shiny line between the various patches of digital infrastructure, or for that matter, societal infrastructure that are owned and maintained by the private or the public components of our sectors. They need to collaborate. They need to integrate. Division of effort, an agreement not to collaborate will kill us, because our adversaries will find those seams, they'll insinuate themselves at us through those seams, and then take us down one at a time. We need to set up the proposition they need to beat all of us to beat one of us. Unless we do that, they will be able to pick us off one at a time.
My one-word answer to my own question would be quantum. In much the way that going into World War I, the tank wasn't thought of, or in 1939, atomic weapons, quantum could have that similar kind of change effect, in that not just achieving AI, but quantum supremacy could reorder the table. But with that, I want to thank you all. What a fantastic conversation. We touched on so many different important themes. I certainly learned a lot, and I want to thank you for joining us, and also Cyber Florida for bringing us all together.
Peter and panel, thanks very much. That too was very thought-provoking, even on a mid Friday afternoon. You've certainly got the brain cells going. So thank you, Chris, Mike, and General Alexander. Keith in absentia. General Alexander had a calendar conflict, so he can't be with us for the Q&A, but we really appreciate the three of you being with us. Let me tell you how the afternoon is going to proceed, and I'll start by giving our panelists fair warning. Peter, Chris, Mike, I'm going to ask each of you the same question. I'd like all of you to be prepared to respond. Something around how the next cyber war, or the next war, is going to start. You've all talked a little bit about it. We're going to play that famous author, Peter Singer, and we're going to give him a scenario or two to play with. Secondly, even though this is the subject of our last panel, you all don't get a chance to participate in it. I hope you're going to stick around to watch it. But what can we do to deter that kind of conflict? Our last panel is going to focus on deterrence. This is your chance to give them some advice. And then lastly, I'm going to ask you to be really, really specific. You've all had lots of recommendations. To the president and to the new administration. And I think even one of you may have been nominated for a post in the new administration. I'm only being partly facetious. Chris Inglis, of course, has been nominated by the president to fill probably the most important cybersecurity position in our federal government. And Chris, we really appreciate you being here today. I can only add that, first, I'm not going to put you on the spot. We know you can't say anything about that. Secondly, I'm going to note for the audience that when you and I first met, you didn't have any gray hair. So I don't know what's happened between now and then. But whether you're talking to yourself or you're talking to that new person, Chris Inglis, what is the one most important thing? If you could go to the president and say, do this one thing right now, what would it be? Number one on the hit parade. So I'm going to ask each of you those questions, ask all of you to respond. And then we're going to take a break. And then we're going to hear from General Frank McKenzie, our co-sponsor and commander of U.S. Central Command, who will provide us his perspective before we get to that last and final panel on deterrence. So if that suits, why don't we get into it? And Peter, you can just listen, but I'm hoping you'll channel this and you'll play the game. So Chris and Mike, let me start with you. How is the next war going to start? You've talked about the future of cyber conflict. Is it going to be a miscalculation? Will we even know about it? Chris, what do you think?
I think it's going to be a miscalculation. I think, as has happened so many times in the past, there'll be a misalignment of expectations. We'll essentially cross each other's red lines that have not yet been declared. We'll suddenly realize that we want to declare a red line, that something egregious, probably by aggregation, has occurred. When we write that red line down on the ground, we'll find that we're both on the wrong side of it. And that all of a sudden we're kind of, with a degree of intensity, begin to take competition to conflict. It will be a scenario where all instruments of power are brought to bear, not least of which influence operations, trying to affect the will of the other side, trying to affect coalitions, whether they form or not. So I think while it might be limited in its kinetic effects, it will be all capabilities, all on in the broader scheme of things.
And Chris, that sounds like something that would potentially rapidly escalate. So starting with an error, maybe even one deliberately planted, but rapidly reaching literally global proportions. Is it that dramatic?
I think so. I think, as in most of these things, when it gets started, it turns out that the incipient conditions have been in place for quite some time. And in order to arrest those, you need to go back a year or two, or double down and try to figure out how you're going to engage in the hard slung for months or more. But they're not easily reversed, given that they're long-standing in their inception. And so, it's like climate change, which is a poor analogy. But if we want to turn back the clock, we've got to go back quite some time, years, tens of years. This can't be done overnight. When you make that kind of a miscalculation such that you tumble into a conflict, you're in the same place. You can't end it as swiftly as you might without utter destruction of the other side. And in today's entangled world, I don't think we're prepared to do that.
So by the time we find out about it, we're well past that fork in the road where we could just do a few small things and stop it. General Green, Mike, what do you think? How's it going to start? Give Peter his next book.
Yeah, that's right. First, let me say congratulations to Chris Inglis. Just fantastic, sir. Really, it's going to be great for our country, and I think it's a wonderful thing. I agree with the way Chris articulated. I do think that there's an element of sort of like walking into this perhaps not as prepared as either side would want to be, and there's an element of hubris and overconfidence that might drive some of that we have to be prepared for. I think when you look at, for example, today, we just talked about the hacking of society and the infiltration of the information environment and the planting of ideas. I mean, to a degree, that has already started or amplified an element of competition. So when you have that, even the president articulated kind of this competition between autocracies and democracies, that has real manifestation in, okay, how do we think about those nations, and how do we think about the potential for conflict? When we think about the vulnerability of hacking societies, I think that we have to be paying attention to this now. I mean, you could say in a very insidious way that the war is already underway, right? And so we have to think about recognizing that, acknowledging that. One of the aspects of an informed society, especially in a society like even under an autocracy, people develop a very good bullshit detector, right? So they know when they're being propagandized. Informed people know when they're being propagandized, and so there's the resilience that we need to build, in our society writ large now. But if you make a mistake, as you're prosecuting that information environment or trying to hack the democracy, you can really spill over into systems warfare quickly. And so this is probably the greatest danger, is the rapid acceleration of warfare as once you get on this machine where every action requires a reaction, and you start to pull together or pull apart infrastructure. So you attack critical infrastructure, you shut down the lights, you shut down the power, and suddenly the conflict becomes very real very quickly, and then demands really strategic level responses. And so I think the new vulnerability of society as a target, the enduring vulnerability of infrastructure as a way to systemize the war and really expand its reach very quickly, and then the rapid tempo of warfare in the machine age is going to be something that's very difficult to control and stop. We have to make sure that as we build our capabilities, we're cognizant of those acceleration risks.
So before I put Peter on the spot, let me go back to something you said that really struck a chord with me. We've talked a lot over the last day and a half now about building resiliency into our systems, networks, hardware, et cetera. But you seem to be suggesting that we need to be building resilience into our citizenry as well. Is that what you're saying? And if so, how the heck do we do that?
I think our societies are maturing to an information age, and kind of as I indicated before, citizens of autocracies have really well developed filters for when they're being lied to, right? I think we underestimate human capacity for even when you're living under a dark cloud. So I think we have to overtly educate, and we have to overtly talk about the risk of influence warfare and the practice of information warfare. And I think that's actually occurring to a degree today, which helps build more resilient citizens, which helps build more resilient democracies. And unfortunately, we still have a challenge with a segmented society, a polarized society today. I think there's still great strength and great resilience within. And we just have to educate and train people to understand when they're being manipulated, and in an information environment where we know, some of our specific autocratic partners are doing everything they can to try to influence our society. We have to respond to that. I mean, we have to focus on strengthening our democracy. We have to focus on all the things that are right with the United States and why we are united as states. What are those things that unite us? And so I think building through education that awareness is probably the best defense that you can have against information effects.
Chris and Peter, I'll ask you to comment on that. Let me just add a quick footnote. Cyber Florida has funded some research on the effects on behavior of social media mis and disinformation campaigns around COVID-19. And it's interesting that while many folks, particularly folks of my generation, know to look at an ad on TV and realize somebody's trying to sell me something, so I'm going to take it with a grain of salt, that same sort of healthy skepticism doesn't seem to apply to things on the internet. If I read it on the internet, it must be true. And so, General, I think that's in part what you're suggesting here, that there is a skill set involved. It's not the same as maybe somebody of my generation was taught. How do we learn to be more discerning cyber citizens when we read stuff on the web, when we are subjected to either inadvertent or deliberate mis and disinformation campaigns? Peter, Chris, do you want to comment?
Well, I'll go. I could not agree more. I think when you think about the history of cyber, there are many ways to cut that, but one way is to think about the waves of our insight. We initially imagined that what we need to do is to defend the data, the systems, the stuff, the commodity of the internet against folks who would have their way with it. We then understood the nature of the dependence of critical functions on that. We began to then figure out the abstraction of all of the stuff into those critical functions. How do you defend that? And now we're beginning to realize that the confidence of societies depends upon not simply their ability to rely on digital infrastructure, but upon the material that comes out of it, the things that waft over us, that we might be the target, this attack on what is sometimes described as wetware. The reason I mentioned those three in sequence is that we pretty much have our arms around what we would do about the defense of both of those first two, even if we've not practiced it to a fairly well. I think we're only beginning to think about how we defend that last set of attacks. Meanwhile, our principal competitors, borderline adversaries, they're actually well ahead of us in this regard and understand quite well how to attack at a society level using information operations, using influence. And for that matter, they also have this sense of the strategic nature of the phase that we're in, because peacetime for them is the decisive phase. If it gets to a place where we have that unfortunate conflict you asked about in the first question, they probably realize that in a head-to-head competition, if we have the time to materially focus time and attention, bring a coalition to bear, will prevail. They don't want it to get to that place, and therefore they're using that third wave of attacks to essentially attack our confidence, our willpower, our psychology. I think that's a big, big deal.
So cybersecurity sort of becomes the ultimate in an asymmetric weapon. Peter, what do you think?
Which do you want me to hit, the disinformation question or how the next war begins?
Yes, in that order, please.
Okay, so to the disinformation side, when we think about the challenge that it's yielded across a wide range of topic areas, whether it's threats to our democracy, all the way down to tactical level targeting of individual military units. It also has huge impact on public health. The infodemic that has surrounded the pandemic is frankly why many of us are still working remotely and tens of thousands of Americans are dead. It just hits across so many different levels. Now, when we talk about the responses to it, the vast majority of the responsive have been debate and policy discussion around either software code change or legal code change. So the software code change side is platform companies, we need you to do X. We need you to alter your algorithms, alter your business model, engage in a different form of content moderation. The legal code side is, okay, we need to change government policy on X, Y, Z, and it's everything from, what is allowed online to people arguing break up the companies. Each of those are incredibly important areas. They're important debates to have. The problem is that they miss first where the research tells us we also ought to be working. There was a look by Carnegie Endowment at over 80 different reports from 51 different organizations about what to do about the problem of mis and disinformation. And the most frequently recommended area was not those two up, was raise our digital literacy as a nation. It's also not just that in terms of the recommendation, it's something that recognizes that this is a human space. It recognizes both the role of the target. We're the one whose clicks are being targeted, the shares, we have agency in it. It also recognizes that the attacker is human. Whatever you alter in the policy, whatever you alter in the content moderation, the attacker is going to shift their tactics, as opposed to if you build up digital literacy, you create that resilience. And then the final value of it, there's two more values. One is that it recognizes other nations that have done better than us at this. So you talked about kind of what comes next in the next panel. Estonia is a tiny nation. It does not have great powers of retaliation. It has not broken up Facebook, and yet it has much better resilience against these threats. Why is it? Because it's altered everything from its intelligence gathering to how it teaches it in its schools. But the final great value of digital literacy is that it respects our First Amendment rights. It doesn't censor, it doesn't tell people what to say, it just equips you with the skills to navigate this world. And as I referenced in the prior discussion, we're really excited to be working with Cyber Florida on a program to bolster digital literacy in Florida through a program to aid K through 12 teachers. The challenge is, you may be aware that Florida is only 1 out of 50 states. You also may be aware that K through 12 is not the only age range that has issues with dealing with misinformation. So there's so much more to do that we could go after.
Well, and at the risk of being a bit shameless and obvious, while we're really excited about the cyber citizenship project we're working on with Peter, we've found just how little there is on the subject and how desperately educators who've thought about this need to be connected. But I think our premise is that if you can do it in Florida, you can do it in 49 other states and the District of Columbia. But Peter, tell us how the next war is going to start without giving away your new book. And then we're going to ask a question about deterrence.
So I can't give, next book plots away or anything like that. So I'm going to approach it a little bit differently. It's what do we know about the opening battles? One is that it's a riff off of, the ad for the original movie Alien: In Space, No One Can Hear You Scream. We don't know when the opening battle of the next major war will be, but we do know, I would argue, that it's going to be silent. It's going to be silent because it's going to be taking place in cyberspace and most likely also parts of it in outer space. So that silent aspect of it. Another is, and this is playing off of what the general referenced, that opening battle, it's probably already happened, at least on the digital side. If we think about the parallel of Russian, we're on an anniversary of Russian interventions into Ukraine. The cyber side of it, they had penetrated their military and civilian networks months, in some situations years, before the first little green man ever crossed the border. So the timeline of it is fundamentally different. Another aspect of this is related to that information warfare side. We did a project with the US Navy that looked at a little bit of a parallel of what Chris was talking about, a crisis unintentionally escalating out like a South China Sea. But one of the things we wrestled with is not just the players, but the media, the public, as this war is beginning, will have different snippets of information and influence operations going on. So as opposed to Pearl Harbor, where it was very clear you were at war, we might be at war and be arguing over whether we're at war or not, and large portions of our population doing so, as we've seen. The re-narrative over the events of January 6th is a great illustration of that. And then finally, what worries me most is actually that we don't even have a war. Now, let me pull back and so I don't get misquoted on that. What I'm talking about is what a NATO writing is referenced as like cognitive warfare. It's the parallel to like the operations in the South China Sea or certain things that the Russians have done, where rather than the overt invasion, seizure of an island, over the course of literally years, you take a variety of steps so that you achieve the same goal. So you get the sort of fait accompli. We've, some people would argue, have already lost the South China Sea by a course of years of buildups. You can imagine certain things playing out in the Arctic or the like. And what I'm getting at is, don't just think of the war playing out as an invasion. It might be in very slow digital and territorial efforts.
Oh, that's kind of scary. All right, let's talk about deterrence. And why don't we take it in that same order? General, you get to go first, Chris Inglis, and then finally Peter. Our last panel is going to focus on cyber deterrence. How do we stop all of this from happening? Is there a cyber equivalent of mutually assured destruction? We've had a previous panel argue about that to no solid conclusion. So I'm wondering, General, starting with you, any thoughts on that? How do we deter that sort of cyber attack, advertent or miscalculation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think Peter's answer was really good for this risk of sort of this escalated competition that maybe just operates just under the threshold of overt military competition and war. And I think thinking maybe a little bit more conventionally about that, because I'm the guy in uniform here. There's an aspect of I would say fighting fast and slow, right? So we're all familiar with thinking fast and slow. And I think you can talk about the evolution of warfare or evolution of a conflict as something that happens fast and slow at the same time. And so you have to deter and then also, defeat that contest or win that contest by thinking fast and thinking slow at the same time as well. So I think for deterrence, I mean, the kind of things that we talked about, the education, the digital literacy, honestly, and Peter referenced Estonia, like credible, trustable digital governance, right? That's visible and transparent across the society. That's the kind of thing that would reinforce democracy, to incredible levels. And so that's the kind of like defending slow or deterring slow that I think we could be thinking about. There is the other aspect, of course, though. Hot wars. The fighting fast is something that we really have to be prepared to do, and that may not manifest, first in the South China Sea. That may manifest through proxies, through other, sort of smoldering wars. I mean, you think about the Russians' actions today as we speak, where it's threat and counter threat and feint and counter feint, and all of that could turn into a hot war, overnight or less. And so we have to be prepared to fight with that kind of tempo. And when I say that, our weapon systems are fast, but our decision processes have to be fast, and our awareness has to be fast. Our relationships with our partners and our allies have to be fast. We won't have time to write emails and convene conferences, right? We have to be able to action that threat, instantaneously. And so I don't think our processes that we have today are at that level yet, right? And this is the artifact of being, joining a digital age, becoming a digital nation, a digital economy, a digital defense, right? Where we actually, we talk a lot in the Defense Department about the OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, and act. In a modernized military environment, you are observing and orienting all the time, which means you can decide and act much quicker, right? And in an information war environment or a warfare in the information environment, when two sides enter, the one that will win, two sides that may have, equivalent military capabilities enter the battle. The one that will win is the one that can make sense, to sense what's going on around it, make sense of that quickly, and then act decisively, faster than its opponent. And so, the OODA loop is something, it's a classic, but it applies in spades here in the information environment. We have to be observing and oriented all the time so that we can decide and act quickly when things get hot. Thanks.
Having spent almost 2 decades in the Pentagon and another 6 or 7 years in the intelligence community, it's worrisome to think about us having to fight fast. Those bureaucracies can be both Byzantine and formidable, but hopefully when it comes to conflict, we can react more quickly. Mr. Inglis, what do you have to say about that? How do we
So I'll start where General Green ended, but would say that on the matter of the OODA loop, I'm a fan of that. My Air Force heritage would not have it otherwise. But that being said, I think that the OODA loop that we're talking about is one where we empower people at the edge to not simply ask questions in a very rapid or answer questions in a very rapid staccato fire, but to ask questions, right? And so if you're going to give the discretion of, they can discern what the challenge of the moment is, they have the authority, the discretion to then address that phenomenon of the moment. You need to equip them with something bigger than a script or a doctrine or a battle plan. You need to understand what the overall strategic goals are, how those then are aided and abetted by values that would inform the decisions they make about what to take on, how to take that on. They need to be agile, maneuverable, self-forming. That's more important for the people than it is for the literal networks or the platforms that those people would make use of. Go straight back to, are we equipping the people who are coming up in these systems with the critical thinking skills and the transcendent value systems that say that we can put them out there on the front edge of this, and the questions they ask and then the answers that they provide to that will be quite comfortable, will address the need. If I could talk a little bit about deterrence, so cyber deterrence, I'll leave aside the predicate, the adjective for the moment, just say deterrence itself. I would note first that there's a lot of discussion back and forth about whether that's even possible. And I think oftentimes that discussion is fouled by our sense of deterrence in the nuclear age. I would note that the word deterrence was a force in society well before the English language came up with a word for it. It was kind of in the earliest days of human beings, a concept that says you can affect the decision calculus of people by the application of either rewards or consequences of a negative sort, but by essentially addressing what they thought was the cost benefit analysis for themselves or organizations or causes that they were associated with. So if you then bring cyber back to the table, given that people are still intimately involved in cyber, they're a part of the noun of cyberspace, I still think that some degree of deterrence is possible. But you need to understand whether it's going to be the absolute kind of deterrence that we thought was the standard of performance in the nuclear age. It's not. The cost of entry is too low. The granularity of our attribution and the tools and the ability that we have to, with timeliness, kind of address the actions of human beings in this are such that what we're always going to have is some degree of mischief, some degree of kind of a roil in this space. But having said that, if we set expectations, if we create resilience and robustness, both in the technology and the people, and to some degree the doctrine, get the roles and responsibilities right, then I think that you will find that there are harder targets for our adversaries to take on. Some of them might take themselves off the field because it's just not worth it anymore. And having made that space defensible, we might then be able to defend it, and with some degree of time synchronization, detect and impose costs on those who would still cross those lines, and in so doing, affect their decision calculus. It's still going to be a bit of a roil. There's still going to be some chaos and contention in this space, but the goal is not complete, perfect security. That's impossible in cyberspace. It's a defensible enterprise that's well defended, where we can outwit, outmaneuver. We're more agile than the adversary in that space. That, I think, is the goal. And so I prefer not to say cyber deterrence, but can we align actions and consequences in a way that we affect the decision calculus of people in that space, both good guys and bad guys? And I think we can.
That's great, Chris. And we'll make. I'm hoping that our final panel is watching. I can tell you that one of the members of that panel, Mike McConnell, is over here in the corner scribbling furiously. So I think he's taking your words to heart. Peter, very quickly, I was worried about being able to fill all of the time until the break. Obviously, that worry was misplaced. Anything we should do about deterrence? Then I'll say a few closing words and we'll head off to break. Peter.
So very rapidly, we need to understand that deterrence has two meanings, as we've unpacked here. One is deterrence by retaliation, the fear that you don't hit me because I might hit you back. It is clear that major state actors, in particular Russia, we're not affecting their decision calculus, and we can see examples of that where literally they're writing into some of the code to make sure that that specific APT is getting credit for that. Or you might have seen the response from SVR yesterday, where they're like, "We don't like the way that you're referring to us." It was almost like there were Reddit posters. To what Chris was talking about, that decision calculus, the great thing about authoritarian regimes is they reveal what they care most about by what they try to censor discussion of. And so that gives us a target to go after. And in particular, it's the decision calculus of oligarchs and where their money is hidden around the world. And it's much the same for Chinese state government officials. I'll leave it at that. However, we need to remember there's a second definition of deterrence, and it's deterrence by denial. It's resilience. You don't hit me because it won't work. And in this, our guideposts for deterrent strategy should be Rocky Balboa and Taylor Swift. Rocky Balboa, when you knock me down, I get back up again. Taylor Swift, shake it off. And to unpack that again, sort of a defined way, we have actors going after our supply chain in a systemic manner. And we've got to build back resilience to that, the resilience on the digital literacy side to, when I say that, knock down and get back up again. A particular challenge in our design, especially in the emerging Internet of Things and critical infrastructure, is that it fails spectacularly rather than fails like an escalator. So when an escalator doesn't work, it's still functional. And so we have to both think about securing supply chain, but also steering the market more towards escalator style solutions. So hopefully that gives some things to chew on.
So a cross between Rocky Balboa and Taylor Swift. I'm having a hard time getting my head around that. But Peter, Mike, and especially Chris Inglis, thank you very much for the time you spent with us this afternoon, as well as the time you spent recording the panel. Again, really heavy stuff. Chris, let me add my personal congratulations to your nomination. For those of you that turned in hoping to hear what Chris Inglis is going to do if he's confirmed, we've deliberately decided not to put him on the spot, knowing that he can't really answer anything when he's been nominated. So we'll look forward, Chris, to hearing you when you're official. I can tell you, and I mean this sincerely, when your name came out, I turned to my wife, who has come to worry about cybersecurity stuff as much as I have, and I said, we should be able to sleep easier at night. And I think we all think that. So again, Peter, Chris, Mike, thanks again. Let's all take a break and reconvene at 1500 hours, 3 o'clock, to hear from General McKenzie. Thanks, everybody.